alienation, freedom and self-determination.
Existentialism is a philosophy that says that each individual is responsible, radically responsible, for his or her own fate. You're the maker of your own life because the world doesn't confer any meaning on your life, so you've got to find it yourself.
Existentialism, as we understand it today, really is a post-war French phenomenon. It really solidified and became clear in Paris, in the writings of Sartre, just before and just after the war.
Sartre's first published novel was Nausea. It's not certain how much impact it had when it was published in 1938. It actually had more impact when it was rediscovered in 1945 after the war. Nevertheless, in retrospect, Nausea is a book which marks, if you like, a turning point both in French literature and in French thoughts.
Then the nausea seized me. I dropped onto the bench. I no longer even knew where I was. I saw the colours slowly spinning around me. I wanted to vomit. And there it is. Since then, the nausea hasn't left me. It holds me in its grip.
The character Roquentin is subject to bouts of quite literal nausea. As these attacks of nausea occur, Roquentin reflects upon them afterwards and comes to some kind of understanding as to what they signify.
This novel, Nausea, portrays a man suffering the agonies of choice. And in the process of suffering these existential agonies, he also finds that the world in which he is experiencing these difficulties, these existential difficulties, is a world which is deeply and radically meaningless. I mean, this is a very important part of the premise of existentialism, that the world offers you nothing, it offers you no value, you have to make it yourself. So when he confronts the world in his experience, he finds that the world turns from a place of houses and trees and parks and other people, all of which seem to have an ordinary everyday significance, into a kind of formless, nauseating mulch.
And then, all of a sudden, there it was, as clear as day. Existence had suddenly unveiled itself. The route, the park gates, the bench, the sparse grass on the lawn, all that had vanished. The diversity of things, their individuality was only an appearance, a veneer. This veneer had melted, leaving soft, monstrous masses in disorder, naked.
For Sartre, there is no grand plan. And he even said, even if God existed, there still wouldn't be a grand plan. It still wouldn't alter the fact that you find yourself here, and that's that, and you have to make do with what you've got. If you question yourself about the meaning of your existence, you won't find any answers ultimately, except the answers that you yourself provide. And this really is I suppose, in as much as existentialism has a message, this is it. That what meaning life has is meaning that you yourself provide through the choices that you make and through the actions that you undertake. You're not fulfilling somebody else's plan or somebody else's meanings, if you like.
Sartre further developed these existential ideas in his next book, Being and Nothingness, which dealt with the idea of freedom.
The big idea, the big central idea of being and nothingness is the idea of freedom, really. And Sartre takes many pages, in fact virtually the whole of the book, arguing philosophically that human beings are essentially free. That realisation is not necessarily pleasant.
It seems odd that the existentialists should think that freedom is a problem when we're all striving for it. You know, we all think that if we won the lottery, that would buy us our freedom. But the existentialists regard freedom as a kind of harsh obligation. You find yourself in the world, and you are really responsible in the end. Nobody else is for how you live your life and what you make of your life.
Morality doesn't consist of a list of commandments which always must be respected. For Sartre, morality, like everything else, is invented. There is only one moral precept which could be said to hold universally in Sartre, and funnily enough it's a biblical one, and that is, you know, thou shalt do unto others as you would have others do unto you. And that involves, if you like, the recognition of the other person's freedom.
And now you get into the terrain of thinking really rather interestingly and carefully about the nature and limits of human action, how we respect one another, how we take one another's interests into account. These are very heavy responsibilities. In fact, they called them the agonies, the agony of freedom and the agony of choice.
People don't always like to be reminded of the fact that the choices they've made were freely made. People in everyday life quite like to offload responsibility for their choices on other people, on circumstances, whatever. Now, this running away from your own freedom is what Sartre calls bad faith. Basically, bad faith describes all the techniques and strategies and tactics that human beings involve to deny their own freedom. In other words, to say, well, actually, I didn't really make that choice. I was forced to make it, or somebody else made it for me. It's not down to me.
A lot of people who live in what the existentialists call bad faith look for some other structure to tell them how to think and how to live. They look to the church, or they look to, traditional political and social structures. But when they do that and let other people make decisions for them, that's wrong in the existentialist view. That's bad faith. If you're not taking responsibility for yourself, you're not accepting this deep freedom that you're thrown into the world with.
But Sartre wasn't the only person wrestling with these ideas of freedom. In 1942, the Algerian-born writer Albert Camus published a book called The Outsider.
If anything, Camus was more of an outsider than Sartre. He was literally an outsider to France, in as much as he was born in one of its overseas territories at the time in Algeria. Whereas Sartre came from a relatively well-off, upper-middle-class background, Camus came from an extremely poor background.
Although it's the case that Sartre and Camus weren't great personal friends, they certainly knew one another. When you look at their work, you see how much they shared in common. They were both extremely gifted writers and thinkers.
Camus' The Outsider was first published in French in 1942 and was in fact favourably reviewed by Sartre at that time, so the two men knew each other via their books, if you like, before they met in person. As the title suggests, it's the novel of an outsider to society, an ordinary office clerk in an Algerian provincial town who one day goes to the beach and for no apparent reason shoots an Arab, is tried for murder and is awaiting his execution.
It was the same sun as on the day of Mother's funeral, but I took a step, just one step forward. The Arab drew his knife and held it out towards me in the sun. The light leapt up off the steel, and it was like a long flashing sword lunging at my forehead. My whole being went tense, and I tightened my grip on the gun. The trigger gave, and it was there, in that sharp but deafening noise, that it all started.
It's often described as being a dispassionate distance kind of narrative. Even when he's talking about the murder, when he's talking about his girlfriend, when his mother dies, he doesn't show any outward sign of grief or mourning, which is not to say that he isn't mourning, which is just to say that he sees no reason to mime or to mimic on the outside what isn't there. It's really this idea of alienation. The world remains ultimately dumb. You can ask it questions, you can interrogate it if you like, but really it will never give you any answers, only the answers that you yourself provide.